Sam, can you hear me okay on your?
I can. Yeah.
Okay, good. Just
Thanks so much
checking.
for joining us today.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and welcome to the April Water Availability and Task Force meeting. Just want to remind everybody to put their name and affiliation in the chat as you jump on, so we have a list of attendees here. I'm going to turn it over here pretty quickly, just because we've got a pretty long agenda today. So first, we've had just with the water year we've had, there seems to be a greater appetite for presentations and conditions on for forecasts on flooding this year. So I know Aaron is on here and you had to take off a little bit early. So just wanted to turn it over to you and we can just get going. So thanks all for being here.
Yeah, Sam, can I have permission to share my screen?
Should be good to go now. Let me know if that works for you.
Perfect. Okay, so I will just kind of jump right into what we're looking at, kind of current conditions and moving forward, just based off of the guidance that we have from recent events today and Climate Prediction Center's forecast for short-term forecasts. But basically where we're sitting at now, Western Colorado is still well over 100% of normal for all of the basins, while our neighbors to the south and east are slowly declining. Each day I look at this, it looks like Pueblo's area, the Arkansas Basin, have decreased a little more. But we're still pretty high, especially in the Four Corners up into the Gunnison Basin, as well as the Yampa and White. So we'll just kind of dive in on those specific conditions. If I take a look at NRCS, they have an interactive map of each of the subbasins. Basically, these deeper blues are any subbasin that's greater than 150% of normal for this time of year. And again, this is just kind of honing in on some areas in the north that are still doing really well. North Fork, Gunnison, and then again down through the Dolores and some of our San Juan subbasins down to the southwest Colorado area. And then kind of what I've been doing for some of my overviews, we've been doing biweekly calls with all of Western Colorado and Eastern Utah folks, like county managers can hop on, and it's not an inclusive meeting. So if any of you would like to hop on, tomorrow is my next meeting. Very similar information that I'm sharing you now. But basically is step through each basin and kind of explain what our current conditions are and maybe some projection forecasts. So starting with the Yampa Basin, this site is looking at 20 different SNOTEL sites and averaging the conditions that we're seeing right now. Still at the 86th percentile of normal, with a little bit of a drop off in that suite from our warming temperatures early April. And then when you see a little spike up, that's like a smaller system rolling through. Just kind of based on our forecast for tonight and through the mid to end week, we are seeing some more snow, especially in our northern mountains. So expect this to kind of increase again. But some things I want to point out on these maps. One, this lime green line, which might be kind of hard to see, but that's the median snow water equivalent, or SWE, based on these 20 sites out of its years of recorded data, which for this basin goes back to 1986, where they only had 11 sites, but now up to 2023 we have 20. And then also I want to point out the X in the middle is the median day peak in our snow water equivalency, or SWE. So we've passed that peak in SWE. It looks like so far this year we've had the peak in early April, and then when we started to warm up, that's when we were seeing a decrease. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, that's when we started to see a lot of issues from the lower level elevations of snowpack melting out pretty rapidly and causing issues in Hayden and Craig and the Highway 40 corridor. But also what I like to show on some of these graphs, you can toggle on other years. So for example, if I toggle on 2011, that was a record year for snowpack. So you can kind of compare where we're at now versus another year. So we did have a time period at the end of March into early April where we're at record high SWE, but we've since declined and are dropping further below that record line from 2011. Really what's going to happen with the rate that we see the snow melt greatly depends on our temperatures and additional spring snowstorms or the potential for more. So that's going to be a huge deciding factor on how we move forward, if this will continue to increase or have a late spike in May, or if it will just continue to follow off and melt off in what typically is the end of June. Another interesting tool that I've been utilizing is their projection SWE graphs. So it's kind of each day they update this based on current conditions. And there's a projection for kind of like worst case scenario of building more snowpack, which would follow the trend from 2011. And worst case scenario, this red line is a minimum projection, which would actually have us melt out pretty early in early June. So a good cursor is just following this 50th percentile line. It's a lime green line here. That's kind of like middle of the run projection with a slower rate of snow melt. Based on our current forecast, we might see some leveling off with the SWE or even a slight increase before we drop off just based on increased snow amounts, which I'll dive into in a little bit. Just moving along, I know you guys are really curious about Western Colorado, so I'm going to hop down to Colorado River Basin. This area is doing a little bit better in terms of snowpack. We're at 76th percentile, which is great, but it's not, it hasn't reached those extreme or record high SWE values like we're seeing in other areas. But yeah, this will be a common trend of seeing a decrease in early April. With a little bit of spike up from our systems last weekend and then decrease each time we've been under a ridge of high pressure. Going to jump down to the Gunnison Basin. This has been another area of interest. We've had some pretty good snowpack. Also, what I should have pointed out initially was this large jump up each towards the beginning and end of March. So that's really a good representation of how much precipitation in the form of snow that we accumulated in each of these basins this year. We just had a very cold, colder than normal March. So a lot of that precipitation fell as snow, even at our lower levels. And typically in March, we start to melt off those lower elevations, but instead we were accumulating more snow, which is why we've been seeing some issues already from the low to mid-level snow melt based on these drop-offs in early April. Again, we're past our median peak, 11 days since the average for this basin. A good year to compare for this one was actually 1993, I believe it was fairly comparable. And then, oh, sorry, that's 83. There we go, that's more like it. So this is a record high snowpack year. We are seeing an earlier decrease in that year. And then I was toggling on 1997. This seemed pretty comparable with a max in early April and then some kind of fluctuations towards the end of April into May, which based on our forecast seems to be kind of similar to what we're seeing now. However, with this next system, it does look like the northern mountains are favored more so than our central areas in Gunnison and then further south. And Dolores, this one has been a pretty interesting basin in terms of snow melt. We also had record high SWEs, so some unprecedented conditions here. We're just now dropping down to the 100th percentile, moving in line with our record SWE out of the 9 sites observed here. But this area has some lower elevation snowpack, which has greatly decreased in early April, and then has continued to decrease each time we get a warming period throughout this month. Again, we should see this kind of taper off again through the weekend, but temperatures beyond that will be a good deciding factor for how quickly this runs out. In the upper San Juan Basin, sitting pretty well at 83, that 83rd percentile. Really saw some leveling out at the end of March, and then some of those higher elevations and median elevations were starting to decrease here in early April. I think some of these sites might be a little bit higher up, so they haven't seen as big of a decrease as some of our other basins, just averaging out the snow tails used here. And last but not least, our lower San Juan, which includes some of the lower elevation that had a lot of snow in southwest Colorado. This one is a pretty drastic graph, but what I do want to point out is we've only had data for these 3 sites since 2010. So we're setting a new curve here with a record high in 2023. And since we've had lower elevation snowpack accumulated in March, that's when we're seeing those more drastic drop-offs due to warm-ups each time we see a ridge of high pressure overhead. And we're well past what has been the median peak so far. Like I said earlier, usually in March you start to see that warm up and decrease. And what was unique about this year was the colder temperatures and increase in snow that we had all the way into March. All the way through March into April. Okay, and then what does that mean in terms of our actual river conditions and our forecasts? So for this information, I rely heavily on our partners at the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. Just moving over to their website, they have a handful of different tools that you can toggle on and off to look at conditions and then forecasts down below. So first, I'm just looking at our current river conditions. This is a really good tool to use when you're curious of what the short-term forecast is or within the next 10 days. So for example, I just toggled on the Dolores River near Cisco, upstream of the confluence with the Colorado. So they have the previous 10 days plotted on the left with future conditions forecasted on the right. So we have exceeded some flood stages at this particular site, with each diurnal warm-up causing a spike overnight, retreating during the day, and we're expecting that to happen again tonight with a decrease in that river condition as we move into the weekend with the colder system coming in. So basically anything that's blue is kind of at a normal level for this time of year. They do highlight areas that have seen a significant rise, either in their forecast data or from what was observed from the gauge itself. And then again, if we have any areas that are approaching or above flood stages that have been defined by the Weather Service, those will turn to an orange or red color. And then another tool I like to utilize is their modeled SWE. So this is similar to NRCS, but what we have plotted here also lower elevations. So NRCS is really focused on the average of SNOTEL data, which doesn't always tell you what's happening at lower elevations or above the SNOTEL. So they're utilizing their snow model and satellite data to capture what snow cover we actually have. So basically any of these darker purples or blues to dark purple are 150 to greater than 500% of normal SWE. So right now we're looking at really unprecedented conditions still over the Uncompahgre along that plateau, and then several parts of the northern Gunnison Basin, and then even still some lower elevations, including all of the San Juans. So it's kind of a good cursor of where your problem areas are, or where you're still seeing a lot of snowpack, normal for this time of year. Interestingly enough, we actually see some decreasing in below 100% of normal for the Colorado headwaters area and some regions along the Colorado Divide. And then also pointing out that the northern mountain ranges, including the Yampa River Basin, are still sitting at that 150 to 300 or 500% of normal. And then I also wanted to show, let me just turn this off because it gets messy. The water supply forecast, kind of where we're sitting. Again, those dark blues to purples are the well above normal, up to 150 to greater than 500% of normal for some of these forecast points. Just one thing to note, it's important to look at how much data each site has. Some of these are have only recorded data for the last 5 to 10 years. It may look a little bit skewed to the extreme end, but nonetheless, the message is pretty consistent that our water supply forecasts are still pretty high for the Yampa River, White River, Northern Gunnison, and again, down in the lower San Juans into the Dolores River Basin as well. And then another tool in terms of actual peak flow forecasts. So this is when we're expecting to have those highest flow rates or the highest peak and stage in each of these main stems that they do forecast points for. So this is a pretty cool tool to use with some of the information. If you actually click on a site, you can open up a new page and it's got this peak flow dashboard. A lot of information here, but some things to focus on. Their 50th percentile forecast. So basically, out of all the scenarios that they run for different types of weather that are expected in the future based on climate data, and I think they include like 30 years of temperature regimes and seasonal changes. So the middle of the line forecast is showing a peak flow that's the 8th highest flow out of the 69 years that they're looking at total data. And then that forecasted actual CFS flow is 1,542 CFS. I do want to note this is updated daily, so you may see some fluctuations in these numbers each day. But what I like about this is they also compare it to a flood flow if it's available, and then when they're estimating that peak flow. So for the Dolores River near Rico, they're expecting this just over 1,500 CFS in early June with a peak float date of June 5th. This map that's included on the side has a lot of information too, but basically the red dashed line is that flood stage that's been determined for the specific gauge. Bank full is at 1,500 CFS. So the 50th percentile forecast right now is exceeding bank full. It does look like it's below flood stage, so probably not a lot of impacts if it were to follow this trend. But the average itself is actually 897 CFS, so still well above average. The shaded colors are kind of like the window of their forecast, like the maximum CFS and the minimum. And then this is started in early February, and every day this model runs and updates based on conditions and accumulated snow. So we started off kind of low and really saw a ramp up when we collected precipitation in March, and then have slowly declined as conditions have started to warm up into early April. And then the line down here at the bottom is just current conditions. So this is where the stream is actually at. So the stream right now is only at 200 CFS. So we're not approaching our peak and flow, but there's still a lot of snow up there based on the maps I was showing earlier of modeled snow data. And then one last thing, this little brown line at the bottom correlates to the normal peak in flow. So that's about mid-May to early mid-June is the normal period for this gauge to have that max CFS. And then, jumping around all my tabs, too much open. In terms of our climate outlooks, this is just the latest information from the Climate Prediction Center. So kind of what happens in the next 2 weeks to month is really going to determine how quickly those SWE graphs change. If we continue to see warming conditions, they'll continue to drop off. But if we see some major troughs and storm systems, then that'll have a big impact on how that graph or how that snow runs off versus accumulates. So for a 6 to 10 day outlook, most of Western Colorado is actually in that near normal. We are seeing like some pretty strong northwest flow over the next week with major troughing over the northern plains in the US. So we are falling maybe slightly below normal temperatures for areas to the north, whereas Four Corners area will be nudging closer to normal versus just slightly above normal. And then in terms of precipitation, we will be just kind of on the edge of that that jet and the contour. So if it nudges any further east, we'll be on the drier side. If that entire system ends up nudging a little bit further west, then we would see a little bit more than normal precipitation for this time period. And then for the 8 to 10 day or 8 to 14 day forecast, we are seeing a little bit more of a nose of warmer temperatures coming in from the Pacific Northwest and then impacting Southwest Colorado. So slightly above normal there, and then slightly below normal temperatures for Northwest Colorado. And again, I think that might be more so with a tilt in that system with maybe some ridging over the Pacific Northwest, and then more of a trophy pattern digging really far deep into central to eastern United States. In terms of precipitation, if we do get some pretty good ridging up in the Pacific Northwest, we might see some westerly winds come in and carry in some of that Pacific moisture across California. Depending on where that strongest plume is, a lot of times the Sierra Nevadas will take a bulk of that moisture, and we kind of get what's left over after the Sierra Nevadas, the Wasatch, and then Rocky Mountains takes the rest. But if that trends further south, we tend to do better with actually accumulating some more moisture. So kind of keep an eye on where this is favored, but the stronger signal right now is off southern to central California with drier conditions to the north. And we really sit with no signal either way at the moment. And then just for kind of some eye candy here, we have snowpack graph here. We'll have on the left side of this bar, this is for this year, our snowpack, early April 2020 is kind of like our peak across all the areas. And then this is where we were at last year to the right. So some areas I want to kind of point out is take a look at the lower elevations in Northwest Colorado and along the Dolores River Basin, and then the Four Corners area. So on top of some of our peaks having abnormally high snow amount, we also are seeing a big increase in those lower elevations. So when we were melting out on those lower elevations last year, we are accumulating more snow this year into early April. So this is where we've had a lot of problems with the lower levels warming up really quickly to like 60 degrees and staying above freezing overnight. That's when we saw a drastic decrease in our snow cover. And then again, too, in the Dolores River Basin down to the south, quite a bit of snow left in the terrain that was able to drain into the Dolores and head north, as well as some of our tributaries here in Southwest Colorado that drain into either Southeast Utah or Northwest New Mexico. So yeah, I think this one is a good indicator of why we're seeing such drastic conditions and comparing those problem areas. On top of that, even some of our highest peaks are much higher snow amounts than what we were seeing last year. And unfortunately, this one does not want to load for me, but I do have it on another presentation, and I just wanted to show you the most recent snowpack. On the left, this is from April 1st, and then the last day we had fairly clear skies. We were able to get a picture on the 18th. Some things I want to point out here is the drastic decrease and low-level snow, again in the Dolores Basin, where we've been seeing a lot of issues in the town of Dolores itself, and then along the just a rapid increase in the Dolores River through the entire channel into Utah, and then meeting it with the Colorado River. It's a little hard to see northwest Colorado with the cloud cover in this image, but a similar story there too, with even just the tablets alone, seeing those low to mid elevation snowpacks really decreasing compared to where we were at the beginning of the month. And one last thing to point out, it might be kind of faint to see in this picture, but there is a little bit of a brown hue here on the snowpack. You can sort of see a nice plume across, like a diagonal line across the region, really impacting those the Grand Mesa and all the way up into the northern mountains in northwest Colorado. And that is from mainly from this dust event that we had April 3rd. But each time we get strong southwest winds, we've been starting to see a lot of dust picking up from Arizona, New Mexico, and getting lofted over our snowpack. So those strong spring winds definitely also impact how we melt off that snow. And if we continue to see events like that, that'll also contribute to how quickly we see those sweetgrass drop off. That's about all I have in terms of current conditions and what could trigger or change that snow melt rate. But if you guys have any specific questions, please feel free to shoot me an email. Again, I will be presenting on this again tomorrow for Western Colorado, pretty similar information. But if you'd like to join that call, right now we're bi-weekly, and I'm sure we will jump up to weekly or even more frequent if necessary as things kind of accelerate and we start moving into the peak flow season. But yeah, that's about all I have. I can stop sharing and chatting and pass it back to you, Sam.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Erin, for presenting at today's meeting. I really appreciate it. I don't know if you want to put your email in the chat in case anyone has any follow-up questions. I know it's about that time that you've got to run. But yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being on. And with that, I will turn it over to Aldis. Let's see.
Oh, Sam, quickly before Erin jumps off, Erin, can you let people know how to register for the biweekly calls? I saw a question in the chat about that.
Sure. I just have a Google link. I'm not sure. Like I can send it out, but I'm not sure how I don't know if you need to register. It's just with a Google invite. I've been working with Callie. She's the one that actually presented or set it all up. So I could shoot her an email too, just to see if anyone needs like to register. But I think you can, if you just get access to that Google invite, then I think it would be okay. And I can pass that to Sam to share with all of you if that's all that needs to be done. Otherwise, I'll double check with her if there's like a registration needed.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much. All right. Well, Erin, thank you again. And yeah, I'll distribute that information and I can get that out if you want to send that over. Perfect. And then Aldis, are you on to present also from NWS? Yep.
I'm on. I think I'll just talk about a couple things. That was well covered for the Western Slope, so we don't need to, go over anything that way again. Let me see if I can share my screen. No, it's not sharing. Okay, I'll just talk then real quick.
Hey,
about-
Aldous.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Ben. I have your presentation, so I'll share it in just a second here.
Well, I was going to share something different instead of that presentation.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay.
I'll just talk about just kind of the eastern slope and the eastern we're doing pretty well when it comes to flooding and having the potential for flooding. There's not a lot of potential for flooding on the eastern side of the state. What is of interest is that so we have around 100, a little over 100%. So kind of a normal snowpack when you look at the South Platte River Basin as a whole, but there's a real difference between the South Platte headwaters in the southern part of that basin compared to the northern part of the basin, the Big Thompson and the Poudre. So we have like 110 to 116% of normal snowpack up in that area, and then we're down to 70 or 69% in the upper headwaters of the South Platte. And then of course the Arkansas is also then lower. So we did not get the snow in that central part of the state, the central mountains that way. And so I just wanted to point that out. It's not flood potential, but it is can be a big difference, and especially with water supply and things like that, that it's going to have a impact on us in the negative way instead of a positive way like the other parts of the state. And I think I'll leave it with that.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Aldous. Does anyone have any questions for Aldous before we move on? Really appreciate you joining today and sharing that information with us. Okay, I'm just gonna check the chat really quick. Well, thank you so much, and I guess we'll move on forward if there isn't any questions. I'm turning it over to David for the flood threat bulletin demonstration, and might need to give you permissions to share here. Unless,
would you mind giving permissions to? Oh, never mind. Alyssa's already got it up.
Already got it covered.
Perfect.
Beat you to it.
All righty. Well, Kevin, again, thanks for having us on today. Last month, I gave kind of a brief update, just again on the season, our upcoming forecast season that will begin May 1st. But to reintroduce the group to the to CWC's flood threat bulletin, it is the state agency's way of putting out the daily flood threat assessments for the state across a number of different products. And the main thing we wanted to highlight today is the complete overhaul of our program website, which has all our operational information. And so we pivoted from our old WordPress-based site to a more dashboard-style tiled format to increase situational awareness of flood threats that may be coming out on daily, to provide a better user experience and also modernize the platform going forward into the future years of our contract and support of the program. So wanted to turn it over to Alyssa, who is our lead hydrometeorologist for the project, to kind of go through and highlight the specific new functionality, because it's quite a bit different, and we wanted to just to highlight the program and the operational website that'll be beginning May 1st.
All right, good morning, everyone. Like David said, I'm Alyssa Dietrich. I'm a meteorologist with Dewberry, and I am so excited to show you this new website. Like David had mentioned, we've spent the entire off season really overhauling this entire site to what you see now. So you can find the flood threat bulletin at coloradofloodthreat.com. And when you first go to the site, you'll find this landing page. This is where you can quickly get all of today's pertinent information for each of the products. And this includes the flood threat bulletin, which identifies areas across Colorado at risk of flooding. On the landing page, that is seen both as this tile, and we'll have an interactive map with those flood threat information. We also have the fire burn forecast, which separates out high risk, high sensitivity burn areas for 11 major burn scars across the state. And then the state precipitation map, which is an overview of recent precipitation and flood reports across the state over the last 1 to 3 days. While you're on this landing page, you can also scroll our Twitter feed, and then you can navigate to any of the products page by clicking any of these tiles, or we also have a drop-down menu up here where you can navigate to them. So first, the flood threat bulletin. On this webpage, you'll find a map displaying the flood threat, as well as a general forecast discussion over here and zone forecasts. One of the major functionality upgrades we've included this season is first a selectable calendar. So you can go and easily navigate to previous dates and see that given flood threat without having to, endlessly scroll through a blog style post. And then we've also added a search feature on the map so you can zoom to your area of interest and it'll automatically move there. Moving along to the fire burn forecast. This product highlights the risk for high sensitivity burn areas for the Calwood, Cameron Peak, Decker, East Troublesome, Grizzly Creek, Middle Fork, Morgan Creek, Pine Gulch, Spring Creek, Sylvan, and Williams Fork fires. We've separated this out into 2 tables, with this table on the left highlighting the forecast for each of those burn areas, and you can see the burn areas on the map, which will be highlighted with their particular threat level as well. And then on the right, we have a table with the burn area information for the previous day, including max 3-hour precipitation, average 24-hour precipitation, and burn area coverage. And then we also include if a flood or debris flow was reported on any given burn scar for a particular day. Again, similar theme with all the maps across the page. You have interactive map functionality where you can select a date or zoom to your area of interest. Not yet highlighted on the landing page, but we will get there, is the twice weekly flood threat outlook. And this is a product that focuses on precipitation probabilities over the next 15 days. And it breaks these out into precipitation chances into individual events that each have their own given threat level, either no apparent threat, elevated threat, or high threat. You can see quantitative precipitation forecasts on this map, and it'll be broken out into individual events, as well as their threat level highlighted on this timeline here. And then we have a space for forecast discussion as well. So each event can have more information associated with it to read. Then on the state precipitation map, this is the only non-forecast product, and it looks back at yesterday's to the next or previous 72-hour conditions across Colorado. We've made huge improvements in our flood and heavy rain report collection pipelines for this season. So we're now automatically pulling reports from multiple sources and displaying them both on the map and on these tables. So you can see here, Lost Canyon Creek and Dolores down here did actually reach minor flood stage yesterday. We also have quantitative precipitation estimates on this map from MetStorm Live, and you can navigate or you toggle here and see past 24, 48, and 72-hour precipitation, as well as the past 24 hours max 1, 2, and 6-hour precipitation. Again, you can zoom to your location of interest so you can see just how much rain fell over your area. And then we have space for a blog style discussion over here to highlight any interesting weather or break down any more details in those flood reports. One more product is the Streamflow Tracker. This is one of our newer products, and it is updated monthly about mid-month, and it reflects the streamflow conditions across the 14 major basins in Colorado. It will be displayed as a table with streamflow information for each basin, and then also contextualizes it against climate normals. And then on the map, we have the gauges here that each basin's streamflow is collected from. If you're interested in learning more about each of the products or the flood threat bulletin in general, you can find that on our About page, which has information about each of the products, how we define a flood threat, and common flood scenarios across the state. We've also included helpful links to more information and any of the seasonal reports dating back all the way to 2012. And then just a few more features I want to highlight. If you're not already signed up, you can use the subscribe button. To sign up for our daily email alerts when the flood threat bulletin is published. So you'll get this little pop-up. You can give us your name and email address, organization if you'd like, and you'll be added to our mailing list to get those daily emails. You can also use this button down here to contact us. It'll automatically populate an email to coloradofloodthreat@gmail.com, where you can send us any questions or comments you may have. And then one last tool I really want to highlight is the Report a Flood. This allows you to submit a flood report directly to us. And so when you click it, you're redirected to this page, and you can enter the date and time of an observed flood, as well as your location. give us a bit more information about the event type, any hazards you may observe, and if you have it, total rainfall, as well as some notes about the event. Then provide us a little bit of contact information if we have any questions and like to reach back out to you about the flood report, and submit that, and it goes directly to us. This is a particularly helpful tool for us for our forecast verification, as well as verifying any flood reports. With that, like I said, we are so excited to begin the 2023 season with this new site that hopefully provides better user engagement, user experience, and also better situational awareness and access to all of our products. Like we said, the season begins operationally on May 1st, and bulletins are then provided daily through the end of September. Hopefully that left us with a few minutes where I'd be happy to take a question or two. Otherwise, David Sutley is the project manager for this, and his information is in the chat, and I can go ahead and put my information in there as well.
Thanks, Alyssa, so much. I would add one thing that is another resource that is also on our About page. Last season, we recorded and held a very well attended training webinar series for the program. It's broken down into quite a few volumes on YouTube for folks to go through and learn more about really what goes into our forecasts, how to use them, and again, just a great resource for users that are of the program. So I'd encourage everyone to, again, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, and we look forward to starting the season. So again, put it back out there for questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much for presenting today. Any questions? Not seeing any questions in the chat. Well, I'm sure if folks think of any questions, your information's in the chat, and I'm sure they'll follow up. So thank you so much for presenting today. Really appreciate you guys being available. So with that, we'll move on to the report from the Colorado Climate Center. Who do we have on today?
Hi, this is Peter Goebel with the Colorado Climate Center. Good to see you, Sam.
Yeah, good to see you as well. Let me make you a co-host really quickly. So
sounds good. I'll
Awesome.
go ahead and share when that's done.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter.
All right, are you seeing my screen?
I am, yes.
Perfect. So for those who don't know me, my name is Peter Goebel with the Colorado Climate Center at Colorado State University. And Aaron did such a good job covering this information earlier. That's it for me. Good night. Obviously, just kidding. Going to do all the normal slides. We're going to talk about the seasonal climate conditions that have brought us to where we are today, do a quick drought update, and then we'll talk about the seasonal forecast and what a developing El Nino means for us here in Colorado. I may play a little bit of 1, 2, skip a few, or go at a little bit faster pace since you've already been listening to various folks talk for 45 minutes and we only have so much time on the agenda. We'll start with a look at our quadrant charts here. This is a look at how March 2023 compared to a normal March. With these quadrant charts and with much of the climate data that I'll be sharing with you today, particularly temperature and precipitation information, the data comes from the National Centers for Environmental Information NCLIME grid product, which is a spatially complete gridded product that goes back to 1900 for Colorado. The data are derived from surface weather stations from networks like the Cooperative Observer Network and other various longer term in general networks. So with that in mind, 2023 March was cold, and I don't think that's going to be a hard sell for anyone on the phone who was in Colorado during March. It was certainly a much cooler than normal month. In terms of recent years to compare it to, there's not a real recent year close by for comparison. Pretty comparable to 1980 would probably be the closest comp there. Looks like we were about 5 degrees below normal with respect to our 1991 through 2020 normals, and close to an inch of precipitation statewide wetter than normal for the month of March. That's a continuation of a trend of, well, not really a trend, but just a streak is probably the better word, of cooler and wetter than normal conditions. This is a similar quadrant chart, but for the water year to date. So we're looking at October through March. And again, you can see that we're landing squarely in that cool and wet quadrant. In fact, I believe every month of the water year to date from October through March has been cooler, averaged statewide, than our 1991 through 2020 normals. So a streak of 6 straight cooler than normal months. Of course, that's averaged statewide, so that's not necessarily true for any given individual point around the state. In terms of recent years that we could compare this to, we're on par with 2010 in terms of being cooler than normal, but we are a little bit wetter than 2010, again, averaged statewide. 2010, I believe, was wetter for the eastern side of Colorado for the water year to date, but it's been so wet out west that overall averaged across the state wetter than 2010 overall. Here's a look at how that breaks out spatially. And this is with respect to the 1901 through 2000 average. I always like to bring that up because the 20th century averages are in general cooler than what we've seen in more recent years. So our 20th century average is cooler than our 1991 through 2020 normal. We're about 3 degrees below the 20th century average for March 2023. And like I mentioned, closer to 5 degrees below normal for when looking at things with respect to our 1991 through 2020 normals. So we especially saw much cooler than normal conditions out west. Aaron highlighted some of the impressive low elevation snowpacks that we saw this year up in the Yampa Basin in particular, but also some of our other basins on the west slopes. And that snowpack helped to keep temperatures cooler. And we saw a top 10 coolest March on record going back to at least 1901 for parts of the west slopes. Things a little bit closer to the 20th century average and still on the cool side of the 2020 or 1991 through 2020 normals for eastern Colorado. Here's a look at our water year to date. Again, this is with respect to the 20th century average. I'll show one in just a slide that's with respect to our 1991 through 2020 normals. But you see that even with respect to the 20th century average, which is cooler than our more recent normals, it's been a cool start to the water year. Again, bringing up that issue of snow cover for much of the winter season, portions of Northeast Colorado were solidly snow covered, which is not always the case. And that snow cover helps to emit energy out to space at a faster rate at night, as well as reflect more sunlight during the day, keeping things cooler during the day. So when you have persistent snow cover, that tends to lead to cooler temperatures. And that was certainly one piece of the puzzle with these cooler temperatures in Northeast Colorado. All right, this is almost our water year to date, just missing the last couple days with respect to our 91 through 2020 normals. The cool colors represent areas that have been cooler than normal, the warm colors warmer than normal. Other than probably one station down in the San Luis Valley that's driving this slightly above normal blip here, we have seen a cooler than normal water year. And this has been particularly pronounced, again, up in the lower elevations in particular of the Yampa and White Basins, where they've had a nice strong snow cover locked in for much of the cool season. And then this is the month of April almost to date. So we've continued our trend of cooler than normal, or again, maybe I should say streak instead of trend, since a trend has some specific connotations with climate. We've continued our streak of cooler than normal temperatures west of the Continental Divide. but in eastern Colorado, especially with the heat wave that we saw last week, that early warm spell, we've seen more area of above normal temperature for the month to date. Across the state as a whole, I think we're leaning on the cool side still, and with what's coming in the forecast, it's likely that we'll lean on the cool side and keep this streak alive, a cooler than normal month, but we will see what happens. All right, like I said, it hasn't been cool every day of the water year so far. April 11th and April 12th and maybe into 13th, we saw a number of temperature records across the state. This is a graphic from our Colorado Agricultural Meteorological Network, or COAGMET, and Northern Water daily maximum temperatures for April 11th. And that early heat spiked things as high as 90 degrees in the northeast quadrant of the state. In Fort Collins, we set a new temperature record for the day of 85, breaking the old record of 80. And we saw records across much of the state with this heat. The exception being, as I'll show here, again, the northwest portion of the state, where when this heat came through, that area had a robust snowpack still on the ground, and that helped to keep temperatures down in the 50s and 60s rather than spiking up into the 70s and 80s. Here, each red dot shows a record that was broken over that warm spell last week, and you can see it covers much of the state, the main exception being northwest Colorado. This is just to show how that spike sort of seemed to come out of nowhere with respect to some of the other conditions that we've had in recent months. Here's some daily temperature data for the water year from Akron, Colorado, going back to the beginning of the water year. Here, the blue bars show you the range from the daily low to the daily high temperature for each day of the water year. The brown kind of belt in the middle of this graphic shows the average temperature range throughout the water year. The red line and blue line show record, warm, and cold, and the red and blue shaded areas show above and below normal temperature conditions. And you can see how throughout much of the cool season, throughout much of the winter and late fall and early spring, we saw more than our fair share of below normal temperatures for Akron, Colorado, and then spiked up to, I believe Akron topped out at 86, though I'd defer to Joel on that, Joel Schneekloth, but into the mid to high 80s, which was certainly a big change from what we had seen earlier in the water year. All right, now I'm going to switch gears a bit into precipitation. And before I show any actual precipitation data, this is just to set our expectations for how important precipitation is in each month of the year. This is showing the average contribution of the month of March to the overall season's precipitation. So areas shaded in the blue greens are areas where March is a wetter than normal month in a typical year, or you expect to see a higher fraction of your precipitation throughout a water year from March than in an average month. Or another way to put that is March is part of the climatological wet season. And then areas where we see these brown colors are where March is part of the climatological dry season. And we can see that out on the Eastern Plains. Having said that, March is not unimportant out on the Eastern Plains. We do expect to see some precipitation rates bump up by the end of March on the Eastern Plains. And those rains or snows can be really important for kind of getting things going with the growing season. Here's what we did experience for March with respect to normal. We see that March was much above average for precipitation on the west slopes, but the Arkansas River Basin was quite dry. Much of the Arkansas River Basin and even parts of the urban corridor and the South Platte River Basin, as Aldous was mentioning earlier, were on the drier end of average for March. Again, these graphics with respect to the 20th century average. With precipitation, we see a lot of year-to-year variation, but the differences between the averages and the 20th century averages and the 91 through 2020 normals are not as significantly different and one directional as they are with temperature, where we have seen temperatures warm significantly over time and precipitation, while highly variable from year to year, we do not see the same significance in trends. So less of a difference between what's average for the 20th century and what's normal for the last 30 years. At any rate, definitely a much drier than normal month for the Arkansas River Basin, with a lot of that area showing a top 10 dry year on record, and then plenty of area on the west slopes, top 10 wet. All right, with that, we're going to move into April. So this is showing similarly to 2 slides ago. The areas in the blue-green are areas where April is part of the wet season, and areas in the browns are April is part of the dry season. I show this to show that April is an important month in Colorado for precipitation. Most of the state, April is at least expected to be a normal month, if not an above normal month with respect to, the seasonal precipitation cycle. And particularly if we look out on the Eastern Plains, we do expect to see that precipitation rates will be elevated by the time we get into April. So it's not unusual to look at weekly precipitation maps in Colorado and see a dry spot over the Eastern Plains throughout much of November through March. But now that we're getting into April, much of Eastern Colorado, we hope to see at least half an inch of precipitation per week. So we've got to kind of adjust our expectations. And so far, our precipitation percentiles for the month of April, or at least most of the first half of April, have been on the drier side. We have seen a few areas that were a little on the wet side of the scale, again, out in Western Colorado, but for the most part, it's been a drier than normal April to date. In a normal year with normal peak snowpack, I'd really be harping on this more, that even if snowpack peaks at a normal value, if we go dry in April and May, that will affect runoff. So we've seen a number of years recently where not only have antecedent conditions been a concern, where we've seen drier soils going into a snowpack accumulation year, but also the snowpacks in years like 2020 and 2021 has kind of failed to, I guess, go to finishing school would be one way to put it, where we've seen drier than normal Aprils and Mays, which has also played an important role in hampering seasonal runoff. This year, I'm not harping on it as much because, as Aaron showed, we have a really robust snowpack over Western Colorado. Not necessarily, as Aldous was saying, not necessarily over Eastern Colorado. Some tributaries like the Big Thompson and the Poudre are in better shape. But the areas where we have these really good snowpacks, even with a drier than normal April and May, at this point, you're not going to miss with the above normal to well above normal runoff. So in some senses, this may be good news to avoid some of the worst flooding concerns or scenarios that could arise. All right, this is, we're just going to take a little bit longer view of precipitation, showing both 6-month and 12-month precipitation rankings. And again, we're seeing the high rankings out west, particularly again at low elevations where it's not just the high snowpack on the snowtells, it's also some of these lower elevations we saw some really good precipitation for the cold season, but then definitely drier than normal for the Arkansas Basin. So a lot of these weather systems that have been great for Western Colorado have been kind of deflected to the north as they cross the continental divide and ejected further to the north. So that's led to areas like the Arkansas Basin really just getting the wind rather than getting the rain and snow, which of course is not as helpful. Here's a look at how things stand with the last 12 months of precipitation. So April 2022 through March 2023. And with the cold season that we've had, still well above normal, even on a 12-month time scale for much of Western Colorado. What starts to creep in here that you may not have seen in the 6-month is areas like the low elevations of the San Luis Valley that actually had a really nice monsoon year last year. They start to show up as above normal, more so than I believe they did on the 6-month time scale. And then the other big thing that shows up here is Northeast Colorado. The Northeastern Plains had a cold and snowy winter. So we saw above normal precipitation over that time frame. However, again, the winter is the dry season for Northeastern Colorado. And if you stack that wet winter on top of what was a really dry summer last year, which is climatologically more the wet season for Eastern Colorado, you still come out well on the dry side of the historical distribution. All right, now I'm going to show how some of these water year accumulations have shaken out on a station-to-station basis. And I'll go through these pretty quickly, but we're going to look at some of our indicator stations around the state using some of the climate regions that were defined in a clustering analysis by Klaus Wolter, starting with Grand Lake as region 1 here, and then working our way around counterclockwise. So starting with Grand Lake, we're sitting at pretty normal for the water year to date. The black line here is the accumulation so far. If you can believe it, we're now over halfway through the water year. The stippled line here, gray stippled line, is the average accumulation throughout the water year. And then each gray trace is what would happen if we put a historical year's precipitation on top of what we've already experienced. And then the blue and red projections are showing kind of an above normal or 75th, I believe, percentile projection, and a below normal or 25th percentile projection. And then the green line is what if we got average from here on out. So you can see sitting at about average for Grand Lake, and we could really go either direction from this point. Steamboat Springs, on the other hand, well above average with the cold season that we've had. And even with some of these drier years, it's nearly locked in that we will have an above average water year. That's not to say there wouldn't be real drought consequences if things completely shut off for the rest of the water year at this point, but certainly sitting in a good position from a drought standpoint, and perhaps a bit of a precarious position, as mentioned earlier, from a flooding standpoint. All right, here's Grand Junction Walker Field, looking at a similar story to Steamboat Springs. And then if we go further south to Montrose, Montrose climatologically is a little bit wetter in summer. So some of these traces do go below the normal line if you project out a dry year, but we still see a high chance of staying above normal for the water year, and certainly above normal where we're at now. Mesa Verde National Park, yeah, way above normal for this time of year. I'll have to check if this is a record water year to date accumulation. It's got to be at least top 5 in the historical distribution, but I will double check that, maybe enter it in the chat later. So all of these traces keep us well above the average water year. And again, from a drought standpoint, this is a great position to be in. From a flooding standpoint, maybe not as much. Alamosa at Bregman Field, we're looking at below normal for the water year to date. But again, with the San Luis Valley, much of the precipitation falls during the monsoon season. So this could turn around, and Alamosa, being fed much of its water supply by the Rio Grande River, where the headwaters are in pretty good shape snowpack wise. This may not be the biggest concern from a drought standpoint. Colorado Springs, strong seasonal cycle here where the warm season is also the wet season. So while Colorado Springs is only at 66% of average for the water year to date, there's plenty of time to make that up. And then as we get out onto the Eastern Plains, here we're in Walsh in Southeast Colorado, way below normal. And again, I'll have to look up how far below normal, if this is top 5, if this is record dry, just where we stand here. But in a precarious situation going into the growing season from a drought standpoint in the southeast corner of the state, there's time to make it up, and the next 4 to 8 weeks could work wonders if we are able to flip the switch. But certainly getting into the time of year where we really need to start seeing those $1 million rains sooner rather than later. Here's a projection for Akron. Akron, like I said, had that nice wet winter, but what this doesn't show is the longer term dryness for Northeast Colorado from before the start of the water year. And then Boulder, Boulder is sitting below normal right now, and that's really developed over the last month with the dry conditions that we saw in March and to start April. The Northern Front Range and Urban Corridor, we expect to see precipitation rates pick up this time of year, and we haven't seen that so much yet. All right, now I'll go ahead and do a quick drought update. Here's where things stand at the current time on the US Drought Monitor. We see that most of eastern Colorado is still covered with some drought designation. The most severe drought designations, I should have pulled the April 18th image. I can maybe pull that up later because we do have an updated drought map from this morning, which fills in this D0. This is now D1. And we've seen this D1 and I believe D0 creep a little bit further to the north and west over the Denver metro area. So we've seen some expansion in drought even in the last week, but with all the temperature and precipitation images, well, precipitation mostly images that I've been showing over the last 20 minutes or so, not a surprise that the Arkansas River Basin is seeing the lion's share of the drought in the state. And then even though we've had a wet winter in Northeast Colorado, balancing that against long-term dryness, we still see a fair bit of moderate drought across the Northeastern Plains. Okay, this map I actually did update. So this is through April 18th, and this is looking at the changes in the US Drought Monitor map over the last 12 weeks. We've seen 1 to 2 category degradations across a large chunk of eastern and central Colorado, particularly over south central Colorado, even one little sliver of Custer County where we've seen a 3 category degradation. And then whatever drought was remaining on the map 12 weeks ago for western Colorado has since been squanched by the well above normal precipitation and snowfall on the west slopes. Here's how things have changed over the last year. So overall, we were hanging on to much more drought a year ago at this time. The west slopes have really broken out of a drought cycle over the last year, where 2020 really through 2022 was part of this drought cycle up until we got into the monsoon season last year that started to really reverse things. And then this great snowpack year that we've had has really finished things off from there. But if we look at eastern Colorado, there are some areas where drought has intensified over the last year. This map is a little bit dated, but we're looking at soil moisture percentiles over the root zone or top meter across the state of Colorado. A number of areas showing good conditions in western Colorado, but most of eastern Colorado is still showing below normal soil moisture. One thing I will say about this is the below normal soil moisture is possibly a little bit overdone on the Eastern Plains because this data product had some issues with its snow algorithm over the winter. that led to some data errors, and that impacted some other data fields more, but soil moisture has likely been affected by that as well. All right, now we'll go ahead and delve into the outlook. Here, we're going to start with just a look at what is expected from May. So this is similar to the maps I showed for March and April. If the area is colored in blue-green, that means May is part of the wet season climatologically. If it's brown, May is part of the dry season. Again, May is a very important month for Colorado. It tends to dry out down in the Four Corners area, but things really moisten up. Okay. I will fix that, just 1 minute. Did you guys lose me at all during that time, or could you hear me throughout and see my slides throughout?
I could hear you throughout and see you. It just obviously lost your slides now when you pulled them down.
Yeah, I've almost got it back.
Perfect.
Okay, things are back. I will go ahead and share again. And here we go. So sorry for the delay. You should be seeing my screen again.
Yep, we're seeing it now.
Great. Okay, like I was mentioning, May is a very important month for Colorado in terms of moisture, especially in eastern Colorado, not only because it's part of the wet season, but also because getting those $1 million rains early on in the growing season is really important for setting crops up for success. We've seen several years recently in eastern Colorado, particularly southeast Colorado, where we have gotten the moisture eventually in months like July and August, but from an agricultural standpoint, that can be too little too late if you're dry in April, May, June. Here's a look at the forecast for the coming 7 days. The European model is a little bit more optimistic than the American models about the storm coming through in the middle of next week. So here, the brown colors are where below normal precipitation is expected, and the blue-green, again, where it's above normal. If things pan out more like the European model is showing at this point, then we could go green across all of eastern Colorado with the storm in the middle of next week, and that could even bring snow to some lower elevations. So it's a little bit early for determining the rain-snow line on that storm. This is, Aaron already covered this nicely, the 8 to 14 day outlook. It looks like we could see some high pressure ridging across the western US, but we're likely to see some cold air pushed down off of the Canadian Shield over much of the central portion of the country. And that's likely to impact especially eastern Colorado to some extent. It's likely that as that cold air moves down across the central CONUS, that at least eastern Colorado, if not northwest Colorado as well, we'll see some precipitation out of that, but it's not looking like a huge moisture producer yet. So near normal precipitation is being forecasted for or at least elevated odds of near normal precipitation across the state of Colorado for the 8 to 14 day time frame. We'll see how that pans out. Plenty of time in our forecasting models for that to change. Once you move beyond the 8 to 14 day outlook, you get into the point where our atmospheric models really descend into chaos. So we have to look at how the deck may be stacked for certain types of storms based on things like sea surface temperatures, or in some cases, land surface parameters like snow cover or like high or low soil moisture conditions. And in this case, we're very curious about a developing El Nino. So for those who have been keeping score at home, we've had La Nina 3 straight years now, 3 straight winters. The La Nina is now gone, and the calling card of El Nino starting to develop here with much above normal sea surface temperature conditions developing off of the coast of South America in the eastern equatorial Pacific. This is expected to begin to spread across the equatorial Pacific. We have high odds of an El Nino developing over the coming months. This cold current, these below normal conditions, temperature conditions along the California coast and much of the western coast of North America, in some ways is a remnant of the La Nina that we've had over the last 3 years. That still may stick around for a little while, but is expected probably to slowly die off as El Nino conditions develop, particularly in areas further towards the equator, probably less certain up near the Gulf of Alaska. But this is a model showing the probability of El Nino, neutral, or La Nina conditions by season over the coming month. So for this spring, we're already in neutral conditions. La Nina is over. As we get into the summer month, by the May, June, July timeframe, there's over a 60% probability of an El Nino developing. And then by the time we get into late summer, early fall, we're looking at a tilt of over 80%, approaching 90% by the coming fall. So there's a really good chance that this El Nino materializes. So the question always becomes after that, what does that mean for our state? This is a correlation graphic showing by season whether El Nino or La Nina is more likely to produce wetter conditions using data from 1951 through 2020. So in the upper left, you have December, January, February, upper right, March, April, May, lower left is our meteorological summer, or June, July, August, and then fall in the lower right, September, October, November. La Nina is preferred over much of the Northern Rockies and Northwest Colorado during winter. But other than that, the red colors indicate areas where El Nino tends to be wetter. That said, these correlations by no means explain all of the variance in precipitation on a seasonal timescale. You can absolutely have a wet spring during La Nina, or absolutely have a dry spring during El Nino, similarly in summer. However, we do see that the deck is stacked at least slightly in favor of wetter conditions during summer and fall if that El Nino does develop. Another point there, since we were talking about flooding, these correlations are stronger east of the continental divide, where the above average moisture would be welcome at this point, rather than perhaps just exacerbating potential flood risks out west. Here's a look at our outlook for the month of May. I think these outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center are super helpful this month. You'll notice that the entire state of Colorado is forecast equal chances of above and below normal temperature and precipitation, or equally clueless for the coming month. These white shaded areas that say equal chances, that does not necessarily mean an increased chance of normal either. It doesn't mean that we'll be in that middle tercile or middle portion of the distribution at all. We could go warm, we could go cold, we could go wet, we could go dry. So this is not the most helpful thing. And just with this rapid transition into El Nino, we're linked to a higher uncertainty as we wait to see what happens with that. That said, if the El Nino does develop rapidly, generally over the late spring, over the month of May, you would see an increase of increase in probability of a cold extreme or a wet extreme over eastern Colorado. So if I were to stick my neck out there and hedge my bet either way for the month of May, I would say for eastern Colorado, you might be able to do a slight tilt toward below normal temperatures and above normal precipitation. But I could certainly be wrong about that. The April WATF calls, I usually like to look forward in the models and try to get a sense of, are we done for the snow season? And I'm certainly not willing to make the bet with Kevin this year of there will be no more snow. Certainly could be into the month of May. This is the May through July outlook. As you get into June and July, you start to see the influence of temperature trends play more of a role in these outlooks. I think it's definitely reasonable that we see increased probability of above normal temperatures start to creep in by June, July. Even if May does go a little bit on the cold side, the summer season is when we see our strongest trends in terms of temperature, in part because the natural year-to-year variation in temperature is smallest during summer. So if you do have a long-term trend, you see that trend more quickly and more clearly during your season with the lowest natural year-to-year variation. Equal chances on the precipitation. Yeah, that's interesting. If we do get this El Nino developing, that bodes in favor of more moist conditions, particularly for eastern Colorado. However, for June in particular, if we're thinking about trend, we do see more of a trend towards drier Junes in recent years. One thing Russ brought up recently was that one potential analog year or comparable year in terms of the El Nino La Nina situation is 1965, I believe it is, where we had a La Nina that lasted a couple years and then quickly gave way to El Nino. And that ended up being quite a wet June on the eastern half of the divide. So, you know, equal chances, maybe if you balance El Nino and trend, makes sense there. And then particularly once we get into June, July, August, you know, the monsoon is still a big question mark. However, the temperature trends that we are seeing in summer, I think it's definitely reasonable to show that elevated probability of above normal temperatures this summer at this point. So the cooler than normal streak that we're on, I don't necessarily expect that to last into summer. It may survive the month of April, and we may have a streak of 7 straight cooler than normal months. It may even survive May. I would be surprised if it survives June, and I'd be really surprised if it survives July. Yeah, this slide, just to put some of those words that I was putting in context about trend, is showing the difference in precipitation from climate models between projections for the middle of this century and the end of last century, or 1971 through 2000. The top slide, you're seeing temperature projections, bottom you're seeing precipitation. And we see that while projections for precipitation, if anything, tend to be towards a little bit wetter than what we've seen historically, there's this dip that we see in climate models during June that, at least in recent years, is fairly consistent with observations. All right, so what we know more certainly that Aaron has already covered nicely is that we have a really nice snowpack on the western slopes, and that we have an above normal runoff locked in, which has great implications for our drought outlook and our water supply outlook, as well as our fire weather outlook for western Colorado, at least for the coming year. Conditions more mixed and on the east side of the divide with snowpack, and then once you get out onto the eastern plains, certainly some dry conditions overall. Recent years, we've been seeing significant wildfire potential risk being elevated in June and into July. And that's not the case this year with the above normal snowpack and the cooler conditions that we've had. So just a quick hooray for that. Flooding, again, I think this was already pretty well covered earlier. A couple things that I can add just from a climatological context. When we get these big snowpacks like what we've seen on the west slopes this year, you hear people say, all right, now cross your fingers for a nice, slow, steady meltdown. And I would argue that climatologically, that's really a tough straw to draw, because even if you're cool and wet in the spring, even if you're cool and wet in April and May, that just leaves you more to melt in June when the sun angles are even higher. So at some point, the heat is going to come and the melt rates are going to pick up. With the heat that we saw last week, we didn't see, we certainly saw the stream flow rates pick way up, but we didn't see as much melt as we might have seen if that heat wave came another week or two later, because the snowpack, I don't think it was, Carl will have more on this, I don't think it was what we'd say isothermal leading into that heat wave. It had been subject to cold conditions for so long before that heat wave that while the heat wave did a lot in terms of the physical process of starting the melt going, it didn't necessarily lead to the highest melt rates that you might expect. Another thing I'd say is that early heat on high snowpack usually doesn't create flooding problems, the exception being 1984, although that wasn't really early, that was June. And then we'll be watching for rain on snow events as well that could lead to more flooding, although it tends to be the South Platte that's most climatologically vulnerable to rain on snow, less so the west slopes. And the South Platte, the snowpack in general isn't as high. Maybe we've got to watch the Cache la Poudre River Basin for rain on snow events as we get into May and June. All right, I'll wrap things up there. Thanks so much for letting me chat about current climate conditions and where we may be going from here. Just a few takeaways. Man, the water year so far has been consistently cooler than normal and consistently wetter than normal out west, although we don't necessarily expect that streak to continue, especially once we get into the summer season. Snowpack has probably peaked as of last week's heat wave, but we're still seeing high snowpack values across much of the west slopes. This is good news from a water supply and drought standpoint, as well as a fire weather standpoint. Short-term forecasts, some possible relief for the Eastern Plains this weekend, middle of next week. More uncertainty beyond that with a lot of those equal chances outlooks that I showed. And then with this large snowpack, we'll be watching for, potential flooding with rain on snow events or additional heat. But the snow probably will come off in episodic bursts when we get warmer conditions and high pressure with clear skies and long days with high sun angles. So I will again wrap it up there. Thank you so much. And if there are questions, I guess I can take those before I stop my screen share.
Peter, hey, this is Kevin. How are you?
Hey, Kevin. I'm good.
As you know, we in the flood world fear the extended warm-ups that bring the snow down quickly. I've looked at the next 7-day forecast and it looks pretty good for that. And I know it's hard to predict what's going on beyond that, but is there anything, and maybe this question is for you or for anybody on the Weather Service that's still on as well. Is there anything you see in the models that might hint at an extended warm-up anytime in the near future?
Yeah, so what I was looking at this morning, it looked like you said the next 7 days look pretty good, and maybe even the next 10 look pretty good. As we get into that first week of May, what I was seeing is there was potential for a warm up with some pretty warm temperatures sometime around the beginning of May that may quickly give way to another another period of cooler than normal conditions, but of course the atmospheric models, by the time you get into the first week of May, you're pushing their predictive skill capabilities. So if there's anyone from the Weather Service who has something to add to that, I'd give way to them, but I'd say just watch the tail end of this month into the start of May.
And I guess the hope would be that by then, maybe a lot of the low elevation snow that's currently around might be gone. So the fear, if there is a warm up, might be for starting to be the larger rivers than the smaller tributaries, like what we've seen in the last week.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Kevin, this is Aldous site. I hesitate a little bit on that on some of the mid-level snowpack, just because we've had some, it's been sticking around a little bit more and it's a little bit more widespread than we've seen in a long time. So in some areas. So
okay, great, thank you.
You know, yeah.
All right, anything else? Okay, I will stop my screen share and we can move on.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Peter. Really appreciate you presenting today. Looks like we've got Carl up next. Thanks so much for being on, Carl.
Yeah, certainly. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, thanks to all the previous presenters, particularly with the Weather Service folks on discussing some more details about the flood potential. There's going to be a bit more overlap than usual in some of this stuff. Trying to think if I have too much follow up on some of Peter's closing thoughts. Yeah, I think a lot of the initial stream flow pulses we've been seeing, some of the ones that I had in mind, Aaron also showed, being like the Yampa and the Dolores. I would guess that those are largely due to kind of the widespread lower elevation snows. We have been seeing quite a number of our high elevation snowpacks, you know, as measured at SNOTEL, hit isothermal, but not really observe too much significant melt. But we are certainly on the cusp where that can happen. And yeah, I certainly agree with a lot of the points that were brought up about the timing of snow melt, that, you know, slow and steady, or, you know, cooler temperatures throughout the spring can slow things down. But definitely agree with Peter that if that persists too long, eventually, once we get those higher solar angles and, you know, just warmer ambient temperatures, eventually it can all melt out. Rain on snow is always a concern. I'm sure most folks in the flood world are familiar with what happened on the Yellowstone last year. Just extremely unprecedented flooding from rain on snow. And, you know, it's a different landscape and a different climatology for sure, but always something to keep an eye on. The one other thing I would note before I really dive in is we did make it through, and Aaron touched on the dust thing a little bit as well, but made it through most of the winter with very minimal dust in the snowpack until I believe it was the first week in April. There was a dry dust event that came through the state, and it was pretty significant. I know on the western slope it was visibly hazy, like limiting visibility to the scale of miles. And I saw some photos from at least like the Aspen and Crested Butte areas showing that dust layer. So that is one additional component that can accelerate snow melt, and particularly the later we get into the season with more intense incoming solar radiation. So just a few offhand thoughts, kind of wrapping up a bit of that last conversation, but I'll go ahead and just dive on in. And yeah, I know we're moving along through our meeting here, so I'll try and be brief and maybe try to not dwell on too many things that have been touched on before. So up in Northwest Colorado, the Yampa White Little Snake combined basins currently at 141% of normal snowpack. Laramie and North Platte at 120% of normal. And also as kind of an introduction, I'll throw out a friendly reminder that, you know, this time of year, as the further we progress into the snowmelt season, and particularly in a year like this with substantial snow on the ground, that these % of normal values that are so commonly referenced do get exaggerated isn't the right term, but basically once our normal values get lower and lower, the % of normal can definitely blow up. So, you know, in another month or so, I'm definitely anticipating we'll be seeing those values of snowpack is 850% of normal or more, you know, some of those values. So I'd always reference back to what peak snowpack was, look at water year to date precipitation. Is because the kind of fine details of snowmelt timing and things like that can really influence these % of normal values. So just a reminder there to make sure you're looking at some other metrics as well. But yeah, I'll keep on moving. So yeah, currently 141% of normal in the 86th percentile. You can see hit peak snowmelt or snowpack accumulation at a pretty near normal time in the Yampa White, Little Snake, and have started to see pretty significant melt at snowtell sites in those basins. Fairly similar temporal pattern in the Laramie and North Platte, but you will notice that our net snowmelt did start occurring quite a bit earlier than normal. A lot of times along the Northern Front Range has a later peak snowpack than a lot of other parts of the state. So I'm guessing just something to note there that did start a little earlier than normal. To water year precipitation, currently 123% of normal in the 84th percentile. Also just noting at our mountain weather station specifically, that has also been touched on in earlier presentations, but April certainly really did dry out quite a bit statewide. So you can kind of see that flat line through most of the month here. Pretty similar over in the Laramie and North Platte at 113% of the median currently. Not a ton of reservoir storage in these basins. Stagecoach is pretty near normal. The other ones we have data for less so, but given the snowpack, I believe replenishing reservoir storage across the state is really going to be of minimal concern this year, particularly in the basins where we do currently still have deficits, which we'll get into here a little bit later. Looking at our long-term reservoir storage, can see holding a bit below normal is kind of the short story throughout the last year or so, but certainly anticipating that to jump up over the coming months. Going into our April 1st streamflow forecasts, statewide, we really saw some significant increases over March 1st with really substantial March precipitation and snowpack accumulation. Again, is just a buffer on these, or just a refresher course, excuse me. It's good to take note of this vertical gray line here is our 100% of normal value. So we can see really the vast majority of these streamflow forecasts have essentially little to no chance of being even close to normal, with all of them being for well above. Going down into the Colorado River Basin, basin-wide snowpack is currently 124% of normal. Really a lot of variability in where that is occurring though. So certainly want to kind of look at your sub-basins or look at if there's any particular snowtell sites you're interested in. See very, very plentiful snowpack on the Grand Mesa here and kind of along the border with the Gunnison. A lot less so in kind of the east central portion of the basin, bordering the South Platte headwaters and the Arkansas headwaters, and then a bit more plentiful up north. So really quite a bit of variability across the Colorado, and we'll see that in the Arkansas and South Platte as well. Very similar pattern to the previous basins, but basically can see pretty significant net snow melt here. It would really take an incredible and unexpected change for the peaks that we've seen really across the state to be exceeded again. So I'd pretty confidently say that we have seen peak snowpack accumulation. Hopefully I don't eat my words there, but certainly starting to see quite a bit of net melt in this basin and statewide. Water year-to-date precipitation a bit lower than the snowpack due to a fairly dry early season at 115% of the normal. Reservoir storage across the Colorado headwaters. Again, this is just kind of a sampling of reservoirs, certainly far from all of them. But some of the major ones are actually above normal: Granby, Green Mountain, Willow Creek there. But again, looking at pretty encouraging stream flow runoffs that will help replenish those. And in some cases, probably more so in other basins, I imagine reservoir management will also be considering flood control pretty heavily as well. We can see over the last year and a half, 2 years really probably at this point, pretty steady increases to pretty near normal values basin wide. Going into our stream flow forecasts, quite a bit less plentiful than we saw in the Yampa and White. Generally near normal to above normal, depending on which ones you're looking at. Kind of our main basin outlet within Colorado, the Colorado near Cameo there, looking at highly probable to have above normal volumetric stream flow runoffs over the next 4 months, or coming up on 3 months now as we're nearing the end of April. Over into the South Platte Basin. South Platte, and I believe I did for the Arkansas as well, I did put the sub-basins on this map because it is very important to note that there is quite a bit of variability basin to basin, with these main stem headwaters holding quite a bit less snow, and then kind of generally getting better as we move further up into the northern Front Range and those tributaries. Again, snowpack appears to have likely peaked, similar timing across the state, but quite a bit earlier than normal at this point. And again, I certainly could eat my words there. We've seen less net melt as far as inches of SWE compared to other areas. So it wouldn't necessarily take an extravagant amount of new snow accumulation to produce a second peak in the South Platte, I would say. But an important thing to note is that for both stream flow volume and timing is once we really start to see significant net melt like this, that does indicate that the snowpack is isothermal. So even if there was additional snow added onto it, it really takes very little energy input to bring that new snow to isothermal and resume melt at a rate commensurate with the other environmental conditions. Water year-to-date precip is actually below normal in the South Platte. Been fairly slow and steady throughout the water year, really after October, but currently at 92% of the median. Here's our kind of sampling of reservoirs. Generally looking pretty good, fairly near normal, more or less. Naturally, with reservoirs or a lot of this data that we present on a basin-wide manner, you're most likely going to be interested in zooming into really what is going to affect you the most directly. Looking at our time series back to 1990, see we had this big spike from our last big snow year in 2019, more or less has been steadily decreasing to below normal values, but still not dramatically so. So on to our stream flow forecasts. So with the lesser snowpack across the South Platte, you can definitely see here's our gray 100% of normal line, with most of these forecasts being for below normal values. These furthest right being only a 10% chance of exceedance. So this first slide is a lot of our forecasts in the main stem headwaters that are these below normal values. And then moving further north in the basin, you can certainly see those shift to these different exceedance probabilities more surrounding that 100% of normal line, and kind of loosely increasing as you move further north. So jumping back over to the western slope for a little bit, where we have certainly some of the most plentiful snowpack and water supply forecasts. Currently 160% of normal in the Gunnison. Not nearly as much variability as we saw in the Colorado. Some things to point out. I know Aaron mentioned the North Fork of the Gunnison is an area that to keep an eye on for potential flooding with a plentiful snowpack on the Grand Mesa. And I feel like with the landscape of that area on the Grand Mesa not having exceptionally high elevation areas, that's certainly a region where a lot of that snow could melt out in a pretty big pulse. Similar, our lone site up on the Uncompahgre Plateau absolutely demolished its all-time SWE record. It was pretty unbelievable. So certainly keep an eye out for potentially water coming off the Uncompahgre Plateau at some of those smaller tributaries pretty quickly. Again, similar temporal pattern with as far as reaching peak snowpack and observing our melt. Pretty near normal timing for that peak to occur. And we shall see what the rest of spring and early summer shall bring us. Water year-to-date precipitation currently 138% of normal, right at the 90th percentile here. And again, we can see it was barely above a record there for a brief moment in mid-March, and it's kind of dried out over the last 3 weeks or so. Reservoir storage is currently quite a bit lower in the Gunnison, and as we'll see in a minute, our combined southwest basins. But again, looking at our volumetric streamflow forecasts, I would be surprised if many, if not all of these reservoirs have the opportunity to fill this year. You're looking at our time series, can kind of see the roller coaster over the last year with a dry 2018, really wet 2019, then kind of dropping since 2019 with kind of some brief ups and downs, but certainly anticipating this graph to be skyrocketing back upwards over the coming months. Going into our streamflow forecasts, again, here's our 100% of normal line, and then our 5 different exceedance probabilities, indicating a very, very high likelihood of well above normal streamflow volumes throughout the April-July period. One of the biggest ones to note here is the Gunnison River Blue Mesa inflow. These are the numbers on here are our forecasted volumes. So you can see our 50% chance of exceedance at 935,000 acre feet is more than the total capacity of Blue Mesa. So that's encouraging for replenishing that volume, which has been pretty steadily depleted over the last couple of years, and also has needed to be used to help support storage at Lake Powell and their power production. Some other ones to note here, we've got our North Fork Gunnison, which has been mentioned a couple times, or some of the highest in the basin. So certainly one to keep an eye on, both from water supply and also a potential flood standpoint there. Naturally flooding being largely influenced by the timing, whereas we're largely focused on that seasonal volumetric parameter. Going down into our combined San Miguel, Dolores, Animas, and San Juan basins, had by far the most plentiful snowpack in the state throughout much of the season, and still does at 182% of normal. And as was pointed out previously, you can really see these massive increases in March. That looks to be maybe in the range of 8 inches of SWE added, averaged across our SNOTEL sites. Got very, very, very near an all-time peak there. And then again, with the timing being very near normal. So a lot to be determined with the rate at which this runs off. But it's certainly going to be some pretty impressive volumes down there. Aaron showed this as well, but had to highlight the Dolores as being the most plentiful, the basin with the most plentiful snowpack overall, well exceeding its all-time records. Water year-to-date precipitation, currently 140% of normal, 97th percentile, and you can see during that similar time period also did breach into all-time record territory. Looking at reservoir storage, I'm just going to jump ahead to our time series here as opposed to just kind of the snapshot of a few. Definitely see the big peak in 2019 and then steadily dropping since then, but certainly encouraging that with this plentiful snowpack and stream flow forecast that this should continue to increase quite significantly over the coming months. So here is a look at those forecasts. And this one, our 100% of normal is just our kind of line here on the left. So all of our major forecast points in those Southwest basins looking to be well above normal. And if you focus in on the scale on the bottom here, really pretty significantly so. Got my mouse here on maybe about 170% of normal volumetric flows is kind of the centroid for a lot of these, here with the Dolores being on the high end. So moving a bit east into the Rio Grande Basin, really basin wide, looking at 117% of normal snowpack, but really huge differences between what we're looking at in the eastern San Juans versus the Sangre de Cristos, where the Sangres really had some of the more meager snowpacks throughout the entirety of the water year and continue to do so. So, you know, looking at probably pretty plentiful snowpacks or stream flows are going to be coming down out of the main stem, Rio Grande here, but maybe less so out of some of the more eastern tributaries. So looking at our time series, snowpack appears to have peaked, generally surrounding pretty near normal values. We've seen some of the most snow melt starting to occur in the Rio Grande compared to other basins and at fairly quick rates so far. Here in our water year-to-date precipitation, currently 106% of normal. Again, you can see pretty good increases throughout March, not so much as in the Southwest basins or the Gunnison. Where am I here? What did I do? But definitely drying out pretty significantly over the last 3 weeks or more, which probably also is contributing to those fast snowmelt rates, having really no major additions as of late. Reservoir storage currently doing quite a bit better than the last two major basins we've been looking at. Some higher, some lower. Again, naturally, you're going to want to focus in on the ones that really affect you directly as opposed to the basin-wide metrics for a lot of these things we're looking at today. Reservoir storage has really remained much closer to normal compared to some of our other Southwest basins, including the Gunnison there, after a big spike in 2019. Some ups and downs, currently residing above normal for the bulk of this current water year. So into our stream flow forecasts, again, as I mentioned, some of the higher forecasts are more in the main stem headwaters, including the South Fork, Rio Grande, kind of coming off Wolf Creek Pass there. Rio Grande at Del Norte is certainly a major forecast in how it relates to our compact for the Rio Grande and downstream obligations. So very, very low probability that we would not observe normal stream flow or below normal through most of these. But again, we see like the Trinchera Creek is a bit lower. And then a lot of these other smaller tributaries do have some lower forecasts as well. Just to hide that one. So over into the Arkansas, our final major basin. Similar to some of the other ones, really significant variability sub-basin to sub-basin. The main stem headwaters here are actually sitting relatively close to normal at 94% of the median snowpack, whereas the lower Arkansas and some of these southern tributaries are quite a bit lower, looking generally around 50 to 55% of normal snowpack. So ton of variability across the Arkansas. Again, we're looking at probably what will be the primary peak snowpack occurring generally near normal, with it having flatlined for a while, and then probably more sites hitting that isothermal point over the last week or so and starting to melt out. Water year-to-date precipitation is below normal at 87% of the median. And again, quite flatlined throughout pretty much all of April here. Reservoir storage, not faring too bad, a bit below normal here. We can see since this big drop off after 2019, some ups and downs, but it's generally been residing in a pretty similar range in the Arkansas. And again, with the high level of variability in snowpack and stream flow forecasts, certainly keep an eye on your local area as the season progresses. So here's our volumetric forecasts. Again, Arkansas at Salida here on the main stem. Our 50% chance of exceedance is looking above normal. Arkansas at Pueblo, slightly lower, but forecast for very near normal values, more or less. And then kind of getting less and less, or forecast for lower and lower volumes relative to normal as we move into the southern tributaries. So lastly, kind of just a review of everything we went over. You can definitely see a pretty significant difference right along our continental divide here. Naturally, with the Laramie and North Platte being on the east side of the divide, but definitely pretty stark difference with Western Colorado having quite a bit more plentiful snowpack compared to some on the eastern side of our mountains. So this, apologies, these labels are a bit small, but I tried to find a size where we could see them and they wouldn't be blocking each other too much. But this is our 7-day delta value of individual SNOTEL stations, where you can see where the melt is happening. You can access this data on our interactive map. It's definitely a really interesting parameter to look at, particularly for folks interested in flood potential. You can look at daily snowmelt rates at individual stations. But so some of these green ones are near the 0 value with just 0 to 1 inches of melt having occurred. And then the yellows, you can kind of see quite a bit more melt. But just wanted to show this, that a lot of this faster melt that we're seeing is at low elevation SNOTEL sites, but we are starting to see it really throughout much of the elevation range. And that will likely increase as time goes by, or will most certainly increase as time goes by. Statewide, currently 131% of normal. timing of this peak, very, very near this normal value here. And we'll certainly continue to do so. But I think looking at the inches of SWE we've lost averaged across all of our SNOTEL sites, again, I at this point, we would need some really significant input on top of the snowpack of new snow, which based on the outlooks we're seeing, I would not anticipate happening. So I'd be pretty confident that we have seen our peak, snowpack peak for this season, even if we have some ups and downs over the coming weeks. Water year-to-date precipitation. Naturally, a lot of these spatial patterns are going to mirror what we see in the snowpack. Certainly some lower values as far as percent of normal is concerned. But again, definitely want to really enforce with our snowpack values, once we are past the peak, it can be really useful to always keep in mind what that peak was and what these water year-to-date precipitation values are. Because yeah, those percent of normal snowpack values can vary quite a bit, even on a day-to-day basis throughout the melt season, and particularly towards the tail end. So here's our month-to-date precip at SNOTEL sites. Again, the Arkansas and Rio Grande have just continued to be some of the drier parts of the state. The Rio Grande, particularly being driven by the Sangre de Cristos, bringing it lower than some of its neighbors to the west, because a lot of these sites in the eastern San Juans did have pretty substantial snowpack. But on the month-to-date basis, as we're looking at here, pretty dry statewide, really, with some of the higher values. Pretty stark difference to what we saw last month. Precipitation at SNOTEL is 115% of normal and in the 81st percentile. Reservoir storage, majority of our major basins, I would say I place generally near normal if we were to lump them, with the exception of the Gunnison and our combined Southwest basins. But again, we are going to be probably looking at some of our most plentiful stream flow volumes in those basins, so anticipating those values to increase over the coming months. So here's a time series looking at all of our major basins. So this dark blue line, so what, again, for those not familiar, what these charts are showing, these are difference from median actually as a volume, so we're not looking at percent of normal with these charts. So basically this statewide deficit that we're looking at here is the summation of all of these other lines. So again, we can see this beige line being our combined Southwest basins, followed by this kind of teal type color being the Gunnison, having by far the biggest volumetric contributors to our statewide reservoir deficit. But again, that is very likely to change over the coming months. Stream flow forecasts. Good news, you know, at a basin-wide snapshot, all major basins are forecast to have near normal volumes, with the Western Slope, Rio Grande, and North Platte all for pretty well above normal volumes. But certainly for folks in the South Platte and Arkansas, really keep an eye on your local conditions. Check those specific forecasts more closely, because quite a bit of spatial variability within those two in particular. So here's our surface water supply index from the Division of Water Resources. So this is from March 1st, before we had those significant precipitation accumulations. Kind of a mixed bag, some of the more plentiful up in the Yampa and in Western Colorado in general, I'll say, but here is following those substantial precipitation events and snowpack increases, subsequent increases to the stream flow forecasts, pretty big boosts in the SWASI from March 1st to April 1st there. So just a quick wrap up. As we have seen pretty significant snow melt start in all major basins. I wouldn't say that's occurred at every SNOTEL site, but just checking kind of a smattering of even some of our high elevation ones, we have start to see some indications that they have reached isothermal, but averaged across every major basin, or the SNOTEL sites across every major basin and statewide, does seem like we have likely hit our primary peak snowpack for the season. Again, don't think we need to beat this to death, but certainly Western Colorado as a generality has fared quite a bit better than particularly the Arkansas and South Platte basins with respect to snowpack. And then going down to the next bullet point, our subsequent stream flows. Big take home point is from our last meeting. We really did see those anticipated increases in the volumetric forecasts with the plentiful precipitation and snowpack additions we saw throughout March. And the Weather Service folks certainly touched on this, that we have seen some signs of early snow melt. I'm guessing a lot of that could be attributed to higher than normal low elevation snowpack. In particular, some of those spikes we saw on the Yampa and in the Dolores are the ones that jumped out to me, that Aaron highlighted as well. And then lastly, currently at least as of April 1st, reservoir storage remained pretty variable with the Gunnison and Southwest basins holding some of the lowest storage values, but certainly anticipating them to catch up very quickly over the coming months. And that is all I have, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has anything.
Well, thanks so much, Carl. I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but anyone just feel free to jump in if you've got any questions for Carl.
Carl, this is Joel. Last month's estimated inflows into Powell, how has those changed compared to last month?
Yeah, let me pull that up for you just one second. Certainly anticipating it to go up pretty significantly, but I can get that number for you real quick. I know, and I'm glad you asked that question, because in a lot of these presentations we do just focus on Colorado, but really a lot of our, particularly in all of Western Colorado, a lot of our reservoir management is most certainly connected to the greater basin. As I mentioned, a couple years ago, we saw pretty significant withdrawals from Blue Mesa, Flaming Gorge, and Navajo to help prop up storage at Powell. And so it is all interconnected, and also going beyond Colorado, we have seen Utah has absolutely demolished its all-time snowpack accumulation records this season. So the portions of Utah that do feed into the Colorado basin are certainly going to contribute pretty significantly to that. So looking at our volume, okay, so wait. Okay, there's Powell. So March 1st, Powell inflow was forecast for 132% of normal. And then April was for 176% of normal. So really a pretty incredible increase in, and I could look up those volumes if you would like, but yeah, basically a 40% of normal increase in the inflow to Powell forecasts. So very, very significant.
Thanks, Carl.
Yeah.
So I know I was looking at CBRFC's forecast, slightly different, but same trend. And it went from 8 million acre feet to 11.3 million from March to April as the 50% most likely.
Okay, yeah, it's looking like, thanks, Aldous. I just pulled up ours looks like our April was volumetrically, it was 10.8 million acre feet, 50% chance of exceedance. And then second. Yeah, so it went from ours March 1st was 8.1 million acre feet inflow up to 10.3 million. Yeah, so similar, fairly similar ranges, but definitely some differences there. Thank you, Aldous.
Awesome. Any other questions for Carl? All right, I'm not seeing any right now. Well, thank you so much, Carl. Really appreciate you presenting today. And just want to turn it over and see if any water providers have updates for today on either storage or drought right now. So I'll open it up for that, and then just anyone feel free to jump in or post in the chat.
This is Swithin with Highland Ranch, Centennial Water. As Aldous and Carl both touched on, the flows or the snowpack in the south end of the South Platte Basin, which is above our intakes, down in the 75% range, with the drier soils going into the year. Stream flow forecast down there is in the 60 to 70% range. Even though our storage in our reservoirs currently for Centennial is looking pretty decent, we did determine last week that we are going to stay in stage 1 of our drought restrictions. That is the second step of 4. We are remaining in that for this period. We'll see if rest of April, May brings us any more precip, but it has been a fairly dry spring so far for the urban Front Range, at least in my opinion.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that update. Really appreciate it. Anyone else? Drought restrictions or storage wants to jump in? All right. Well, not seeing anyone jumping in right now. Feel free if anyone wants to share information to shoot an email. I can put my email here in the chat, and but with that, I think we will conclude today's meeting. So thank you all for staying until the bitter end, and look forward to seeing you next month. Take care.